My greatest concern, my single greatest concern, this president's going to try to steal this election. This is a guy who said that all mail-in ballots are fraudulent, voting by mail, while he sits behind the desk in the Oval Office and writes his mail-in ballot to vote in the primary.
Welcome back to Newsmax Now. I'm Dave Briggs, filling in for John Bachman. Today, former Vice President Joe Biden says President Trump will attempt to steal the 2020 election. Biden's comments came in response to a question there from Daily Show host Trevor Noah about the voting chaos in Georgia we saw this week. People in Atlanta waiting hours to cast their votes. Democrats are concerned this chaos could carry over into the 2020 general election, but Republicans say the alternative, an expanded mail-in voting process, could lead to more voter fraud. Joining us now, former Obama advisor and Democratic strategist Laurie A. Watkins. Also with us, Dan O'Donnell, the host of the Dan O'Donnell Show on Milwaukee's News Talk 1130. Great to see you both. Laurie, let's start with you. What do you think of Joe Biden introducing the concept that the president is going to steal the election, let alone going on to say if he wins, the military will remove President Trump from the White House? Why introduce this dangerous concept?
Well, I think what Joe Biden is trying to say is we're not talking about voter fraud, even though that's what the president and his administration keeps touting, is that voting by mail is going to create a fraudulent system. What we're talking about here is voter suppression. We saw that in real live color in Georgia on Tuesday. People waiting up to 4 or 5 hours after midnight standing in line. You had voting machines that did not work. You had people going to polling places that were not at all equipped to handle the amount of voters. So we have systemic problems. So many people, including the president, right here in the state of Florida, he votes by mail. A lot of people vote by mail, and we've been doing that here in the state of Florida for a very long time. What I think states need to understand is we do have a presidential election coming up, and we need to make sure that every single state, every single county is prepared for this so we do not have the problem that happened in Georgia. And I think the vice president calling out and saying that, this is about, the president keeps claiming that this is about fraud is exactly that. It is voter suppression. Voter suppression, plain and simple. We're not talking about fraud.
Want to jump in there, Laurie. It's one thing to have some problems in Georgia. It's another thing, Dan, to make the leap that the president is going to steal this election. A lot of times it's difficult to follow the thinking of Joe Biden. What do you make of those comments?
Well, first of all, I would like to agree that this might have been an attempt at voter suppression in Atlanta, which has been run by Democrats since the 1870s. We saw the exact same thing in Wisconsin during our presidential primary on April 7th. There were massive lines in Milwaukee, which has been run by a Democratic or socialist mayor since 1908. In Green Bay, where the Democratic mayor closed all but just a tiny fraction of the polling places. In terms of vote by mail being ripe for fraud, don't take President Trump's word for it. Seriously, don't. You know which president you should listen to? Jimmy Carter. In 2005, he helped co-chair a bipartisan commission on election reform. Do you know what one of their chief conclusions was? This was Jimmy Carter. That vote by mail remains the single biggest potential for voter fraud.
Wrong. I think by what he meant also, if I could jump in here, is voter fraud equals voter suppression. Preventing people from having their right to vote is stealing an election because you are preventing people that have the right to vote having access to vote. When you do that, that's fraud.
Yeah, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms should be real embarrassed of her suppression attempts.
Want to keep this conversation moving. Want to keep this conversation moving, guys, to talk about something else, Joe Biden.
Been run by Democrats.
Guys,
elections are
we're
run
going
by
to
the
move
local
to
officials.
something else. We're going to move to something else that the president said, vice president said last night with The Daily Show, talking about systemic racism. Listen.
Donald Trump didn't invent racism, but he sure has promoted it. And it's systemic, has been real. The disparities in the country, especially in the economy right now, the combination, there's just an awful combination. COVID-19, unemployment, systemic racism.
Joe Biden again last night on The Daily Show, a senator for 36 years, a vice president for 8 years, and the author, the champion of the 1994 crime bill, which as recently as 2015, Laurie, Joe Biden called it the Biden crime bill, one that Bill Clinton said, I signed a bill that made the problem worse. How is he the guy? What tells you Joe Biden is the man for this moment or this movement?
I'm encouraged that Joe Biden is getting specific and trying to meet the moment, whether it's reforming the crime bill for mandatory minimums, abolishing the death penalty, or a federal ban on chokeholds, or new force standards by the police. He has come a long way from that bill, just like Bill Clinton, and he understands. Now let's compare Biden to Trump, who, as you mentioned earlier, he has sabotaged a law that is guaranteed health insurance for African Americans. He has undermined voting protection for African Americans. His Justice Department has stopped going after police departments that have discriminated against African Americans, rolled back environmental policies. But beyond policy, the president has used rhetoric that suggests that citizenship of African Americans and those minorities is conditional, and they are second-class citizens, basically. Worse, perhaps, than all of those policy issues is that he repeatedly refuses to denounce the KKK and white supremacists. He did that during his campaign, and he's doing that now in his presidency. So whether he's deeming African Americans as second-class citizens, taking away their health care, making it harder to vote, that's what Joe Biden's talking about.
He has, of course, denounced the KKK. It was also President Trump that signed into law the criminal justice reform. But Dan, I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Oh, I will. And it's amazing that I actually agree with Laurie, because what President Trump said, I've actually got this right here, is despicable. We have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. They are beyond the pale of many of those people, beyond the pale. A cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience. We have an obligation to cordon them off from the rest of society. Oh, wait, no, I'm sorry. That was actually Joe Biden in a speech in 1993 talking about predators on our streets. As recently as just a couple of weeks ago, he was questioning people's blackness if they don't vote for him, saying on Charlemagne the God's radio show, if you are still trying to decide between me and Trump, you ain't black. In the 2012 presidential election, he said of Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan, to a black audience, they're going to put y'all back in chains. That's a direct quote. You tell me how this guy is at all able to make charges of racism or inappropriate comments against President Trump.
A lot to reconcile for Joe Biden in the months ahead, well beyond the 1994 crime bill. Laurie A. Watkins, Dan O'Donnell, really appreciate you both bringing this spirited debate. Wish we had more time, but thank you both.
Thanks,
My
Dave.
pleasure.
Coming up, when can we see Disneyland reopen? We'll tell you in today's catch-up right after the break.